Well, you asked, or the question was asked, what about some of the mind effects?
Yeah.
I'll try to answer that and say, from what I recall of the program, because I was part of it also, as well as Duncan.
As an officer or a
Civilian.
Civilian who is used?
Used is the correct term, very definitely used.
You were subjected to the
Well, yes, I was subjected to the, let's say, the mind control field, not as I initially went in the program, because they wanted me at one point for my psychic metaphysical abilities, and you don't subject a person who is sensitive to those kind of fields because they know they will wipe them out or alter them so drastically that they're useless. But they assigned me to a particular part of the program involving the indoctrination of the younger recruits, we'll put it that way. And after, let us say, one of the first attempts at indoctrination, which turned out to be a total disaster, I said, there's no way I will have any part of this program, no matter what you do or say. So they said, oh, yes, you will. And I said, well, no, I won't. So they put me in front of this roasting oven, if you will, the mind beam, and it did do damage to me. And finally somebody else said, shut it off. He isn't going to give in to it. I suffered some damage, but not severe damage as some others did. And it did affect me to some extent. Duncan was affected much more heavily for other reasons. But nevertheless, the effects were, in some cases, totally disastrous. They burned brains out and the people just dropped dead. Now, neither of us were among those category, but there were other recruits, young kids they picked up, you might say, off the streets, wherever they could find them. The basic age bracket was between 12 and 16.
So that's where a lot of the disappearing
Yes.
kids disappear.
10,000 we estimate went to Montauk. The total number would be about 250,000 with the 25 stations estimated. What the actual final directives, what the final thrust of the program was in terms of these kids, we had never come up with the answers. They wanted them fully programmed for something, and we've never found out why. And eventually they disappeared off the station. They were sent to various locations and places. But they were initially subjected to one form of programming, and then later on it changed into a somewhat more humane, a somewhat faster and less obtrusive form of programming and conditioning using the electronic techniques. The original was Reichian and was more physical and was less sophisticated. The later programs, after they worked out the techniques to use of computers, electronic programming, and the electronic use of the Reichian techniques, and it became very fast, very quick, and usually took very well with no side effects. And these kids would never know what happened to them. They shipped them back to where they got them or to wherever they wanted them to go. They would know the better.
Are you aware of the names or identities or the present locations of any of the individuals?
I've run into a number of people over the years, let's say in the last 3 years, since I've become aware of the program and the fact that I was part of it. There is a very specific field identity pattern you can detect. If you're sensitive enough to read human auras, you can spot a person that's been through the Montauk program 5 miles away. Their auras are very distinctive in the way that they have been altered. You can tell them immediately if you know what you're looking for. And I've spotted many. I would say over a dozen. Mostly in the Long Island, New York area.
Wasn't, when Newman was officially dead, right? Well,
correct. Officially he was dead, but he was very much alive throughout this entire program, all the way through 83 and for quite some time after that, up into this year, through this year.
Oh, these bad families afterward?
Don't know exactly the whole story of what's happened to von Neumann since, because he ran into a problem with the government. And he ran into two problems. One, he suffered a personality split himself about 1977. Whether it was because of some of the experiments he was on or the strain, we don't know. But he resigned as director. He said he was no longer fit. The government wouldn't leave him alone. They wouldn't let him leave. They said you will remain as a consultant, which was agreeable to him, to the balance of the program. Because there were other reasons why he had to be there, which goes back into the whole Philadelphia experiment. But he remained on as a consultant. At the end, he told them, he says, when this program is over, he says, I'm not going to work for the government again ever, no matter what you say. He says, I'm through with you. He says, I want no further part of any of your government operations. and he retired to his little farm and led a relatively peaceful life for a period of time until he was harassed again in the last year and a half. But that's not part of the Montauk thing.
Right.
Was he living under another name then?
He was.
Mhm.
He was living under a pseudonym.
When did he officially die?
1957.
57.
That's the official death date.
What happened to the other scientists? Food and, what was it, Intamin?
Pruitt was there until 83.
Yeah.
And then he went and worked in different corporations and disappeared.
Hodgman was seen to turn up. You ran into him.
Yeah, a couple of times, and that was it.
Yeah, and then he
Other than he
disappeared.
ran for the hills, I think.
Most of them did. They ran for the hills.
Well, let's continue on the description of the Phoenix Project.
I just have one more question about the Montauk. Were any of the subjects given psychotropic substances? LSD?
I don't know.
We don't believe so.
My gut feeling is no.
In conjunction with the
I don't believe they were.
No, they used other drugs. They had one drug that would be used in connection with the Reich programming. It would make them more receptive.
This was not.
Do you know
part
the name of the drug, the chemical name, or a generic name?
No, I don't.
I have no knowledge of
Can you
that at all.
describe any of the effects of that alone, or in conjunction with the...
Okay, the effects would make you horny as hell.
Uh-huh.
That's essentially what it would do. It would make you very sexually active.
Also euphoric at the same time.
Yeah.
And euphoric?
Well, that would go along with it.
Right.
What was the purpose of being euphoric?
All right.
Make sure you
Essentially,
open
I
the
don't.
Or they get the chair from the aliens?
We're not sure whether they got the chair itself from the aliens, but the
Did they get a
technology
prototype from the
base
aliens?
came. Yes, the prototype came from the aliens.
Willingly
They
or
produced
from
it.
a crashed saucer?
Maybe
exchange of sorts.
we don't know.
Also, I had another question on what you were describing before. Could this experience that is becoming very common of the UFO abduction could have been programmed by
I
the
think-
government under this mind control?
Sure, it could be. Not all of it is, but some of it probably is.
Some of it.
All right, but they got this chair from the aliens, or through some connection. Another associate of ours was on the station managing money, and he actually went out and bought this chair from somebody. He hasn't been able to dig out yet who. So what they essentially did is they took this chair, they made one computer to interface the chair itself to stay in the digital codes, and then another computer to interface it to a special computer to the transmitter, and then the transmitter. What they actually ended up with, in essence, was a mind amplifier. Duncan here, his major responsibility on the station, he was one of the selected individuals. He had been through a lot of psychic training by the government to sit in that chair and generate thought form. The idea they had is, okay, they can transmit the signature digitally. That worked very well. They could put the person in the orgasmic state digitally. That worked very well. But they wanted a human being to generate the actual thought form, the details of what they wanted done.
From the chair.
From the chair, yeah. In other words, they would put into Duncan's mind, when he's in a trance, what they want him to think of, what they want him to think of that he's doing. The chair would pick it up. After the data was sent, that would turn on the target individual. His thoughts were channeled directly through the transmitter to the individual. It worked, but it didn't work. It worked very well, extremely well. But they found another capability. Let's say they would target Phil at Tuesday, 4 a.m. when he's asleep. You might actually discover that Phil was actually hit 2 weeks later. What did they discover? They did not block the time in of the person. What did they get? They got a time machine. Next bright idea they got was, okay, let's tell Duncan to think of a vortex connecting 1981 to 1947. He would do this. What happened? They got a vortex going from 1981 to 1947. You can walk through. Great. Now,
Duncan you had to be really good to be able to visualize. And
Duncan's very good at
you have to
visualizing.
be really an expert, I would think.
Well, let's not go into that at this point.
Well, you're talking about it at this point. That's why I bring it up.
A master is a word in the dictionary.
It's the word I use. What you want.
Well, we're talking of earlier capabilities, not today. He was also raked over as well. But, what they discovered is, okay, the real time he thought of it, what they discovered is they recorded it, put the tape on the computer, did the same thing again. So now they had a tape that would open a vortex. And they started going back in time, they started going ahead in time, they actually got the time machine. That's the last phase of the Phoenix project, was the time machine. Of
And
course,
they could control that time factor to where they wanted to
Yep.
go.
Right.
whatever he thought of, or other people like him. He wasn't the only one. They had to have at least 5 backups.
That was still phase 2.
That was phase 3.
Phase 3.
Yeah, was the time machine.
Now, that time machine, what do you know the date?
That got going about 79 to 80. They got that operational. Of course,
Fully operational?
yeah, about
And it
79
can
to 80.
transmit both matter and
Thought.
signals.
Yeah,
and,
right. They had this, you could walk through the vortex. You could walk in 1981 and come out in 47.
Who, Cameron would, or the one?
Anyone.
Can you explain
I
again
don't-
how this was this developed?
What was the mechanism behind it?
First of all, this
Right.
transmitter was so freaking powerful. This transmitter had enough power to warp space and time, go through Bearden's equations. There's more than enough power to do it. He had the capability of thinking of the vortex function that they couldn't synthesize. They didn't know how to synthesize that vortex function, but he knew. Innately, inherently, he knew how to do it.
Can it be mechanically synthesized right now?
I'm sure they got the tapes. I'm sure they got the tapes. Now, also, things they did was they would have the subject that's sitting in the chair think of a creature. And that creature would precipitate itself. They would have the subject think, there's a car coming up the road, stop the car. The car would stop. There'd be no electrical activity in it. They would have the subject in the chair think of change the direction of the fish. And the fish would do this sort of thing. They would have the subject think all the animals on Montauk Point are going to charge into the town. There's records of that even to this day, of all animal life coming off the point charging into the town. There'd be, you talk to the local kids, now they're young adults out at Montauk, that lived out at Montauk, you'll find out there's rumors of kids hearing big things stomping around the woods on the point. That's what came out of somebody's mind, precipitated through this huge mind amplifier. They almost had the power of creation. They could almost create a being. The problem they had is the being only stayed as long as the transmitter was on. Flip the switch. The being stopped all its mobility and faded back into hyperspace. But that's how powerful this thing was. This thing, you're talking gigawatts, and the etheric power probably many, many terawatts. You're talking astronomical etheric power. Because they're using multiple pulse modulated amplifiers on top of pulse modulated amplifiers, opening different windows from the drive of this amp to that amp, and you can encode all sorts of zero-point functions as you go through what they call the amplidyne function. See, the amplidyne is essentially a zero-point amplifier. So by the time they started pulsing the 100-watt stage, by the time they got out to the half a gigawatt output, the etheric power was up in the sky. This thing was tremendous. This transmitter, it took at times 2 generators supplying a megawatt each to run this thing. They were pumping 2 megawatts into this whole building, which you'll see pictures of. But, I don't think I can overstate how much power, as far as we're concerned in this room, it's astronomical power this thing had. This thing literally had, if the person who was sitting in the chair thought of a time warp and a vortex, that vortex would form.
Excuse me, does this have any military applications that you're aware of? Silly question.
I can think of thousands.
And is that why
millions of-
is that why Eastern Europe's almost free today? Because the Russians are simply scared of this? I don't know.
Who knows? There's also other thoughts that other outside groups are saying to the Earth government, you straighten up or ship out.
When
Who
you
knows?
said people could walk through this time vortex.
right.
Did you ever walk through the time vortex?
No comment.
Do you know anybody that did? That
Oh, yes.
Could you describe at least the experience, or?
Ow.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I did more than once, and it's weird, to say the least. The recollection is that you.
First of all, how is it formed? Just at the beginning, before it's created, what do you see? Before it's created?
Before it's created, you see nothing but the building or the
Or the
area
section.
that you're in.
You're in a chair or in
No.
an open space?
No, what they finally ended up doing was they took whatever Duncan or his alternates would generate, they put it on tape.
Okay.
Now, it could generate it inside the underground area, or it could generate the
From anywhere to anywhere.
or
Anywhere in
generate it
space
outside. It
time.
can be from any particular point where they chose to generate the origin, and it would go to the terminal
Wherever they
point.
want.
It could happen while you were,
was where?
The terminal point would be wherever they chose it to be.
and you could be driving a car when
Future,
this
the
happened.
past.
You probably,
I mean, what would happen if you were driving a car?
Your car will go through it.
if your car went into the entrance of it, yes, a car would go through and come out at the other end where it was. It could be 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 years in the future or the past.
You would actually.
I've run,
Let's go to that other time to describe what
Whatever
Why
went in
don't we
the
just
beginning,
start
the
describe what
entrance
happened?
would come out the other end.
I've
the car
run
be spatially
computer
dislocated?
modeling.
I'm sorry?
Could the car be spatially dislocated? Could it be somewhere else in the universe?
Sure could.
Yes.
I've run computer modeling based upon calculations I've learned from the radio science and such, and the vortex could have a diameter of 5 miles. Could be a 5-mile opening, or of course they could bring it down.
We can send
to,
all of Long Island.
no,
So what was it like, Al? You were saying.
It's like looking into the entrance of a peculiar spiral tunnel which was lit all the way down. You would start to walk into this thing, and then suddenly you'd be pulled down it. You would more or less be projected. You didn't walk through it as such. You were more or less propelled through it.
you walked into it.
You walked into it, correct, start. Then you were propelled down the thing like some force grabbed you and pulled you through, and you come out the other end, wherever it is. You could be far in the past, you could be in the future, it could be very close by, and it could definitely be another place, physically, other than the point where you started and usually was.
Wherever whatever point in space and time the transmitter was set to transmit to.
Emphasize space and time,
Right.
because it could be anywhere in the universe.
Did you go back or forward in time?
Either one.
Either way.
Were
What
you
was it
physically there? Could you interact with other things
Yes.
there?
Yes.
You could take
Did you do that?
You could take remnants back with you. You could take like for example, if you projected yourself to go to another planet, you could bring something back with you.
Sure
Yes, you
could.
could.
Has
So
that
if you
been
could
done
live
to
on
your
the other
knowledge?
planet.
Yeah, right. I can't answer that for certain, but I would say probably.
Have you ever personally brought anything back from another time, either past or future?
Yes.
Was it of terrestrial origin or?
Yes, in this case it was terrestrial origin. It was a Life magazine from the year 1983 to take it back to 1943, but that's part of the Philadelphia story.
That's still continuing the Phoenix Project yet.
How did
You guys asked the question of what it was
Okay,
like.
the description of the vortex. Please continue.
Well, the description was it was like a tunnel, coruscating corkscrew, sort of lit, sort of looked like the walls were,
Solid or moving?
they were solid, but they were fluted. It was not a solid bore through rock, as you would
Right.
think. It was a fluted sort of structure. And you would go down this, and you would be propelled down this tube, as it were, this tunnel, which was not straight. It was corkscrew. And it would not go in a straight line either. It would take some very strange turns, which you could not explain. But it did take turns, and you'd come out at the other end, wherever you were supposed to come out, and meet somebody or do something at the other point.
Did you have like a mission?
Yes. Then you would return. Then when whatever you were doing was completed, the tunnel would reopen for you, and you go in the other direction. You walk back in it, go back to where you came from.
Exact reverse of what happened when you went there.
If someone switched off the power, would you be able to get back?
No.
No, you'd be
No,
lost in
you'd be
time
stuck
and
there.
space.
And they never get back.
You would not get back.
People
unless-
were lost at
That's what I was
Montauk.
asking.
People were lost.
Yeah.
Wow.
I've heard of that.
Was everyone who went through one of these programmees?
Possibly.
Possibly, we don't know of all of those people, those young kids who were programmed, what the final intent was. We only have a little glimmering of part of it now, and this is in the last week or two, and it's very incomplete.
Was
It's been a
anything
mystery
ever-
to us for a long time. What was the end goal of all of these kids being programmed? What did they want to do with them? I mean, 10,000 there and all the other stations? There had to be a reason.
When you said people were lost, does that mean that if the machine was turned off, instant disintegration or just abandoned in that time period?
It would depend on which happened first. In other words, if
Okay.
they went down the tunnel and got to their termination,
They were fine.
they were fine. And if the tunnel was turned off and they couldn't get it refocused to that area in time, that the person was lost there. They were abandoned, so to speak,
They were
and trapped in
floating in
that time or
hyperspace.
location. If the tunnel disintegrated while they were in transit, they were lost. That's
And if they
disintegrated.
were abandoned in time,
Yeah, they could be abandoned.
and
in
this is
time.
going to be a sort of a philosophical question,
Yeah.
wouldn't they be angry and do something really wild to alter the future?
Depends on where they were abandoned.
Well, they did not abandon people in time. The problem was that the transmitter would glitch, and as you were in transit from time 1 to time 2, the tunnel would collapse,
Yeah.
and you were lost.
You might be lost intact, you might be lost in a form of being atomically disintegrated, in which
Who
case you
knows?
were totally lost.
But the philosophical question is valid. I mean, where you would go back in the past, could you alter the future?
Sure you
Of
can.
course.
Has it been done?
Has it
Say
been
right
done?
now.
Yes, there-
That's the reason we
Reason
exist in a time loop right now. What we do from one end to what Montauk penetrated in the past to what we do to where Montauk penetrated in the future is now fixed. Because it's fed back on itself. It's now a fixed,
It is fixed.
it's fixed right now. Has to be because of that. It has to be fixed.
You went forward in time.
Went forward and backwards both. One of the first things they did with the raw recruits, as it were, after they passed the initial tests and examination to see if they were suitable for the program, and they were found suitable. I don't know what the reason was, but I do remember that one of the things they did was they sent every raw recruit forward into the future to a year around 6030 AD, and it was always to the same point, someplace in the future in the middle of an abandoned city with a square where there was still a statue in solid gold. And they would ask them to look at this and see what they saw after they came back. And they interpreted whatever the individual saw, for what purpose I'm not sure, but this was one instance where apparently all recruits were sent to this point in time to see what they saw, and whether they were expecting to find a different answer, and from person to person, I don't know.
Were they equipped with protective suits or equipment?
No, ordinary clothes.
That's if they were going to a friendly environment.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sending someone into the future, you know, into a possible nuclear...
Well, they first would look into the future through the vortex. They could sample the air, they could sample everything on this side.
Now, were there different potential futures that people could be sent to?
No, because once you make the first connection into the future, it's fixed. Anything from that future point back is fixed.
But what I'm saying is, are there different
That's the
alternate
reason the
futures
government
that they could go
times-
into?
The first projection, yes, there's multiple different futures. But once the first projection is made into the future, from that point back, from the future, let's say they project from 83 to the future.
Okay.
From this point back, it's not fixed. Because the fact that he went from here to here has not fixed the time
Even
flow.
after they turn off the machine
Yeah.
or whatever?
Because the fact they turned off the machine does not alter that he was here and then came back.
Then that sounds like you couldn't change the present by sending someone to the past.
Yes,
Vice
you
Very
versa.
can.
definitely.
You can, yes,
Yes. You
exactly.
can change the present by sending someone into the future, too,
Right.
for that matter.
Yep.
And
How do you
often
change the
certain-
present by sending someone into the future?
Under certain conditions, you can.
When it's a closed loop, you can.
Cameron, had you gone into the future at all?
Yes, I've seen the horse, which Al speaks of. It's
Oh, the golden statue.
the golden statue. It's a horse with no rider. It's an abandoned city. It's sort of like a dream state. It's very peculiar, where there is virtually no dynamic ability ongoing. It's a very stationary, almost frozen state.
No markings on the statue, no, did you know what it was, what it referred to?
I don't think I can say.
Beyond that, you want to make any statements about anything else in the future that might interest people or that you could talk about without doing damage?
Only in the fact that when there is a function that is presented ahead, there are increments that from that particular point in time, which was propagated from, there will be effect back to the initial point of reference. That is the nature of the beast, as Preston spoke.
Yeah.
Once you have a reference,
Once you close the loop.
whether it be ahead or behind, that doesn't necessarily mean that that particular point in the future cannot be changed. Everything and nothing is possible. So
If there
along
were
those lines-
changes that were going on in the future, you can't really do much about that yourself, could you?
That's correct.
But could it be just like a projection or something, or not the real future? Some kind of condition
Duncan-
thing on the mind?
To answer the question, depending upon what realism set of functions, however they be real or manifested or surrealistic, depending what function and what time line, there are many timelines and functions of realism. Depending where you're going and where you attribute the point of reference, that determines how it will affect, as let's say you and I here, as to us here directly, the realistic point, how much that, let's say it's a manifested realism, that could have some effect here, but not that dramatically, as something, let's say, us sitting here 20 years ahead, that is in our space and framework and function of time, so that would affect us more dramatically than just something that was sort of created.
Okay, say that one psychic sets up a vortex to the future and we use that and then we shut that one down. If another psychic sets up a vortex to the future, will it go to the same future or
No.
can it go to a different one?
They go to wherever the function is generated to go to.
That's correct.
Okay.
There had to be people who were really controlling this very exactly and specifically.
Oh, yes.
Surely.
Very definitely.
Very much.
But what I'm saying is it'll go to a different place in time, but will it be on the same timeline, the same reality as the first psychic's vortex?
As long as it's before the most furthest point they projected
Okay.
ahead, yes, it will be. In fact, the government is using that today to, the existing time machines still flow in the Montauk line.
Okay,
It
now,
has to.
okay, once they have done that, can we go back in time and change the past to change the present, and then the future will be changed?
You already did it. With the loop
I
closed,
just-
everybody does automatically what they're supposed to do. If
The
you
loop has
from
been
the
closed
future-
once you've gone to the future.
Right.
So we don't have to worry about our present being changed now,
No, it can't be changed.
because we've already looped to the future through it.
And through the past.
Right.
If, let's say this
Okay.
is 83, let's say this is year 1, this is year 1000. And you go from 83 to year 1, from 83 to year, 2000. Anywhere between 2000 and 1, now you fed it back on itself. That means
So it's locked.
whatever the people do in here, they're going to do forever and ever. We're in an endless do loop in the computer right now.
What is the furthest forward anyone has traveled that you know of?
10,000.
So that's all locked through 10,000.
Unless the
Can you
vortex
describe
can be broken.
can you describe any recollection of anybody you know that has traveled that far into the future?
Nobody has ever gotten that far into the future and gotten into a real, almost like a running life situation, so we don't know what it is. As Duncan described, it always appears to be like a dream state where they hardly ever encounter any other people.
What about, all right, as far as going into the future and encountering people on Earth, okay, how far ahead is that?
Near term.
I believe they've gone about 10,000 years ahead.
But you still.
And encountered people.
No, what I'm saying is encountered something other than a dreamlike or a sublimated state. Interacted with.
How far can you go and get a tangible, real future? Or can you do that?
No one's gotten a tangible, real future beyond 2012.
2012, 13, 14.
Somewhere in there.
Depends.
Does that indicate that maybe things have changed so radically at that time that there isn't anything else to see?
Something's happened.
There is a very, very abrupt wall there with nothing on the other side.
But the prophecies speak of the earth changes at those times.
Curious, isn't it?
Yes, isn't it?
Did
We're
you,
locked
in
through
your
to at
travels, did you ever, Cameron, learn so much that for yourself it really was of value to you and not so much to others, but...
Okay, you have to realize the intelligence at the particular time. I now can sit here and speak of this in a matter-of-fact terms.
Right.
When the project having to do with out in Montauk was ongoing, I was very much not myself. In control of other, control of other people, functions, forms.
they control your...
I beg your pardon, that's
Right.
correct.
Right.
In the control of, I should say. So I gained only what...
They wanted you to.
That's correct, basically.
Did they also deprive you of sleep and food and things like this to make you more malleable? Or
No.
simply?
Basically, that's sort of corny.
Right.
I don't mean to demean your question,
No, I understand.
but it was very elementary in the
Right.
procedures that they did.
How
have.
long were you permitted to stay in the time period? Would it
Hour
vary?
time.
Hours, minutes, seconds?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
If you were put into a time period, forward or back, okay?
How much
How
on our
long
clock?
were you permitted to stay there? How long would the vortex stay open?
As long as they ran the transmitter.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
what was
sounds-
what was the mean time that someone would stay in the future? Minutes, seconds, days, hours?
I can't answer that.
hard
That
to
question
say.
is not answerable,
No.
considering
I mean,
the
in your
format for which we're
perception of
traveling.
time, in your perception of
No,
time.
not
There is no
his perception.
there is no such
The people who were running it.
consideration of perception of time during that period. It's
There
very.
It wasn't a deal where they were told you got an hour to do the job, you gotta be back in an hour.
Does that mean that when you went back, for the people on this side, it appeared you just went in and came right back
Yeah.
out?
Yeah.
So,
Sure, basically.
So you
Yeah.
basically left and returned at the same time, no matter how much time you spent. Some went
sure.
else.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's true.
There were a few points where the thing glitched and you might have returned an hour later,
But
but it wasn't meant to.
basically, when you deal in the avenues of what Preston and Al call hyperspace, there is no such thing as time per se. It's in causality.
Right.
In theory and in function, you can return before you even start.
Right.
When they return you before you started, you don't remember what happened.
That
That's
Can happen
one of
and
the
did
ways they erase memories.
They did that intentionally.
Yeah.
Very.
They have you do a job, go through the job, and then they return you to maybe milliseconds before you started. At that point, it becomes an isolated loop. You're detached from it. You can't even attach the Akashic record from that.
Right.
What was the shortest period of time that you know of someone traveling forward in time? Enough time to see himself coming through the vortex?
okay, you're again asking Preston.
Okay.
He has information of such. I don't mean to demean your question.
I know that he has a lot of general information. You have specific information. So if anyone wants to answer that,
Mhm.
the shortest period of time, like for example, if there's seconds between the time you enter the vortex and the time you arrive, could you put yourself in the future? For example, could you put yourself in the future 20 seconds or a minute or 3 minutes and and meet yourself.
Okay, what he's getting at is, can you project yourself, let's say, 2 hours in the future and then meet yourself 2 hours in the future?
Right.
Yes, you can. It's very dangerous.
Has it been done, to your knowledge?
No, it has not been done because when you walk through the tunnel, the way the tunnel was created, the person that walked in one end was out of phase with the person that walked out of the other end, and if he met himself, poof, was gone.
Like matter and antimatter?
Yeah.
Very much.
Like, but not quite like that.
Okay, just to add to something, what Preston says, in theory, this is what happens. Indeed, it did happen.
It did happen.
Oh, sure. As a matter of test run and procedure.
And the person did not survive.
Well, sure, it was literally just blown apart.
Yeah.
It's just incinerated.
That's when they
Just to be
found
corny.
out that the transmitter did the phase reversal number. Still, they don't understand exactly what phase reversal it is. It's not normal phase reversal. It's
Cameron, if at a time you went into the future and you were in a point of danger, let's say in some situation you didn't expect, did you ever come across that sort of thing where, like that situation, right in the moment, whatever it was?
Well, on a metaphysical basis and theory, since I was educated in that sense, when you start moving through space and time, it is of necessity to start looking around and seeing what's going on other than supposedly straight ahead. All different functions and violations of all sorts of things that go on.
They're breaking all sorts of laws.
Really?
Oh, sure.
The physical laws.
To answer your question directly, though, I have passed myself in view, not made a connection of sort. You just don't do that.
Have you ever given anything to protect you against anything you would come across if it was a life and death situation? As people go into the jungles and they have weapons, let's say, or you're on a mission, you have weapons. But you would go into the future. If you met something and you were really in danger, what would you do if you didn't have a weapon of some sort? Did they give you, did you carry such a thing?
Or would you have immediate access to the portal?
Okay, I think
I
I
have
could
no-
answer that.
I have no
Just curious about it.
information on that.
I
I
think
can't
I
answer
could
that.
answer that. First of all, they could design the vortex so it would follow him, and they could essentially view what's happening to him in the future.
Oh, they were viewing you
That
also.
means this I do remember. I'm sorry. This I know happened. That they could follow the person in the future or the past. Anything dangerous start to happen, they just bring them back automatically. It was like a mission control where there was a group of people watching what went on, and they were able to talk to him. He could talk back to them. You know, that they had set up so that when they speak into a mic on the station, he could hear it. And of course, they hear what he says to the speakers on the station, and that whole monitoring setup operational. And they also had the capability with the transmitter to run the vortex right over him and pull him back without him walking in it. They walk the vortex to him. If he started to encounter anything dangerous, zoop, he'd be pulled back and he'd be out of it.
Excuse me, put me down if I'm jumping ahead, but was the vortex, as many of us have read, first opened with the Philadelphia experiment in 1942-43?
Yes.
Are you going to be talking about that later?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we will be. As soon as we can get over this hurdle here.
Right.
Fascinating hurdle, you know?
That's a good size one.
Very fascinating.
Also, because I remember hearing that lecture when you first talked about it, the circumstances by which this project was cancelled in such
But we haven't got that
in a
far
panic
yet.
situation.
Yeah.
No, I know.
We haven't got that far. Let's at this point continue. We can.
Well, I got a related question real quick. When you went into the future and saw the horse, was that by any chance something to scare you into agreeing to do what they wanted to prevent something, or?
It was more of a view, just to consider indeed what was there and critique.
Yep.
So they really wanted to know something.
Like a reference point.
Yeah, a test is
It was a test, basically.
Quiz.
We're all getting the same answer.
They wanted to see if everybody
Cameron.
came back with basically the same view, the same information. Test your powers of observation, whatever.
Okay.
What did you see? Describe it in detail. Not only the horse, but the surrounding city that was in ruins. Well, do you have any ideas why? Did you see anybody there? Did you see anything else?
So,
Et cetera, et cetera.
so when you would go through the vortex, If you were to go through right now, you disappear from this spot?
Yes,
Oh, yes.
very definitely.
You wouldn't be here.
I got you.
You'd just be on the viewers.
Right.
All right. Let's continue.
One more question. Could this system of the vortex without the technological trappings, but have been something similar to how Nostradamus or the prophets or whatever were supposed to see the future?
Who knows?
I mean,
That's
speculating.
Who
Totally
knows?
unknown.
I assume movies were sometimes taken in the past.
Well, movies can be made right off the viewers.
Oh, really?
They could do that off the viewer?
Sure.
Like,
The viewer was a video signal. You put the viewer right onto a videotape machine.
Wow.
what kind of files must they have somewhere on all
You must have
Yes,
some great home
good
movies.
question. What kind
Somebody
of
else
file?
see it.
Somebody-
All right.
Home movies.
home movies? Yeah, the good
Oh,
ones.
what
the
a
good
file
stuff.
of home movies.
Sounds like a
right?
title for a sci-fi movie about this.
And question of the year, do you have any of these tapes? No.
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 They were closely guarded. I know the tapes were made because I saw them, but they were closely guarded.
You saw the tape?
Well, I have to admit, I think I have to admit at this point, I was there too. I was the guy that built the transmitter. Rebuilt the transmitter.
That's
See, they did the number on me where I would go to work. And then I would be taken out to Montauk. I'd do 10 hours work, then they would bring me back, run me back to millisecond or so before I left, and I never knew what happened. I had to reference to that period to pull my memories. And I have done it. I pulled most of the memories. That's how I can talk of the viewer. I was the one that designed and built the viewer. Of course, I had tremendous facilities behind me to do it. I
And
can't
staff
do it today.
and information
Right.
and
not like
computers
the
and
garage.
No, not like my garage.
No.
educators.
To continue, all right, they got the working time portal, the working time vortex. Somebody on the station realized, hey, we're headed for a mess. We gotta stop this thing. Just like in the old movie Donovan's Brain, what was done was in one of these chair subjects' minds, there was a little thought implanted that you're going to pull a monster out of the id, a monster out of the subconscious, and transmit it through the transmitter on site. And the person went in, lay down in the chair, went into this thing, and there was no one else in the room, which happened every once in a blue moon, but it did happen. This person snuck in and said, okay, the time is now, whatever the keyword was. At that point, the person unleashed through the transmitter the form, and the transmitter precipitated this huge, big, black, hairy thing that was hungry. It ate everything in sight, buildings, people, ground, and they went into a panic when they couldn't control this thing and stop it. Pruitt says, shut the transmitter off. They go down to the power station, shut down the generators, throw the switches, freaking thing didn't stop. It kept going. It was still hungry and still eating.
This was on the base?
Yeah, on the base.
Actually, we're eating people and
Yep.
machinery and everything.
Yep.
And smashing everything you could
And
get into
buildings.
the site.
How big was this thing?
Buildings.
About 30 foot tall.
Storage barrier.
Solid or?
Yeah, it was solid. Sure. The transmitter had the capability to precipitate this
Right.
thing. We knew at that point the transmitter could do it. And finally, Pruitt said, okay, he's got to go up and cut the wires that come out of the ground into the radar building. They cut those wires. He figured maybe there was wires got miswired on the ground and was getting power from somewhere besides the generator house. Cut the wire. Freaking thing still continued to work. And then they kept going. They cut the wires inside the building. Freaking thing continued to work. No one could walk upstairs at that point. The energy was so heavy you couldn't even get above the first floor. They tried cutting everything to the first floor to shut this freaking thing off. Now, to try to go ahead a little, what had actually happened is they had made a connection on that day that Junior was released with the Philadelphia experiment. Somebody had to go shut off the Philadelphia generators. I will go into that. That's his field of expertise. When the generators are shut off on the Eldridge, then Pruitt was able to take acetylene torches and go up and cut the transmitter apart in Montauk. You go out to this day, you'll see where there's acetylene torch marks and everything. on the equipment.
You can go on the base now?
Yeah, he can.
Yeah, it's wide open.
And this was in '83.
Yeah, 83, August 12, 1983. Okay, at that point, anyone that was left, they dragged into a site that we won't disclose at this point and did the total brainwashing number on it. So you didn't remember a thing. All of us sitting here were brainwashed, so we didn't remember anything. Except that he found his way to my place. And that's when the deprogramming started.
You're one of the two you spoke of on the tape? Or somebody who came to your house to tell you about what happened? Or were you speaking to Cameron or Al?
Cameron.
Okay.
How did you happen to go to Preston's place, Cameron? Instinct?
Directed or instinct or perchance, it's hard to say. There's a story that goes along with it. It's sort of long and bulky, but somehow it comes up that indeed I was directed to, still under influence and command, so to speak, to disrupt Preston and his work.
At that point, they were getting worried about me because I was starting to stumble into Montauk in real life.
You were remembering things, or you were just, you had occasion to go
over
there?
the years, one of the problems with this thing that they set up, although you don't remember any of the work you did, little bits and pieces of it filter through. I developed a huge interest in esoteric technology, psychotronics, psychic activity. I was researching this to the nth degree. I had a team of psychics working with me. We were trying to figure out what was the energy form and all this stuff. I knew in the mid-'70s there was a source of psychic interference here on Long Island. And after a couple of years, I was able to trace it right out to Montauk. So I had my eye on Montauk for years. Of course, I could never get on there. The security was thick. Although it was a derelict base, there was security guards all over the place. And all I know is a friend of mine from out east calls me up and says, Preston, the old Montauk Air Base is wide open. When do you want to go look? I said, tomorrow. And I was out there that morning with my friend. We walked all around. First thing, when military pulls out of a base, what do? They clean everything up. They take everything with them. There was junk strewn over the whole base. There were files dumped out of a file cabinet just filling one room in the big building, the floor of one room. Equipment was still left. Power was still on in sections of the base. You had to flip switches and the lights would come
Where
on.
these people gone?
They just fled, zoom.
Because they were scared of this creature?
They fled in utter panic.
Right.
What happened with the monster?
That's real responsible military for you.
When the transmitter was shut off, was finally cut apart, the monster stopped animation and over a period of days just faded back into hyperspace. See, all these things were active, tunnels, creations, whatever, as long as that transmitter was functioning. Either it got power from the site or it got power from the Eldridge. It didn't matter where it got its power from.
What happened to this person who created this id or whatever? Is that one of you?
I don't know if these guys want to say.
Well, information, there is a photograph that was taken just in routine basis out in Montauk that was presented in the first select show, Preston in 85, 6? Chicago, was it? USPA conference. There were random photos taken, and one of the gentlemen from Situ, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does that stand for?
Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained.
He looked at a photograph and said there's something there unusual. There was a blow-up of it, and there was a sort of what's been categorized as sort of like a Bigfoot. What I see on that is myself, as an image of myself riding the back of it.
And that identifies where it came from.
How much, I'm very startled with the photograph for sure. It does seem to have a connection with me, even though I try to discredit it.
Is this in one of these slides? One of these ones?
Oh, no.
It's there.
Is it?
It's in the collection of slides.
Ah,
It's in one of the slides. Very small.
So it was still
This
like
would
a
be very
faint image or something.
Right, a faint image.
So this would be very similar to the quote-unquote it or the shadow or whatever
yeah, could probably be.
technological technique you want to use.
Yeah, just an add-on here. Preston spoke of a 30-foot type creature. There are a number of images associated. 30 feet is by all means could very well be correct. 9 feet, 10 feet, depending which image is considered.
Also, perhaps how scared the individual was who saw it.
Well, some
these
of the
tails
marks,
grow.
some of the marks on the buildings are up quite high. It
Yeah.
had to be like 30,
There's at
it had
least
to be at least
15.
25 feet
I would say
On the
at least
outside or
15,
inside?
probably more.
outside.
So
They're
what,
still
meaning
visible?
it got outside and it was attacking the building from the outside?
Oh yeah,
All right.
it was rolling free.
Was it like a monkey type big, like King Kong?
It was very similar
or
in
like
appearance to one of the Bigfoot,
Bigfoot.
which you showed, and I've seen pictures of, I'm sure, at various times.
But
in places.
huge.
But huge. Instead of being 7 foot, it was perhaps closer to 30. My original impression was, when I first went on the base, it was perhaps 30 foot high.
Now, to the best of your knowledge, how was this creature created yet? Was there some kind of someone decided
It was
this was
him.
to be created?
Yeah, some person, we're not sure who it was at this point, felt like the rest of us here that this was going too far, it was
Right.
getting dangerous, and there was going to be problems in the future. It had to be brought to a stop. The project had to be crashed. And the most effective way to crash it was to make something
Program the
hungry that would
creation of a
cause them
creature.
to panic. Throw them into a
Information,
panic.
information that someone was tapped on the shoulder somehow and did some business to do this. Some
That's
information was passed along.
You wonder if you worked there at all or not, but you have been living with your folks for a long time. Don't they know? Did you ever ask them what you were doing in these time
He
periods?
had no time loss. They returned
They
him
returned
immediately
before it
after.
Just before it happened.
Yeah.
Before it happened. So he was never gone. Even though he could have been out looking for himself
I
during
came
that time,
home
he was
from
not
work.
gone.
So freaking
I
tired.
understand.
I do.
So you essentially lived a couple of years in 1 year.
How do you make a living
I went
normally?
through the
I
same
mean, let's
thing.
say outside of this project.
As a microwave engineer.
And you're still getting a check.
Oh, yeah.
And a paycheck or whatever.
I
you
come
want.
home from work. I felt like I'd worked 20 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, anywhere
Probably
in there.
worked even more.
And since about 83, I haven't had that. Since 83, I've been fine. But from about 75 until 83, God, was I tired. But I wouldn't remember any of it because they would bring me back to milliseconds before I left and it'd be a closed loop. But the experience and the education would come through. That's why I went into metaphysics. Because this other project, I was heavily in metaphysics. Originally, before that, I was a nuts and bolts electronics type person. I didn't even... Metaphysics? That was my reaction.
Yeah.
But
This is for idiots type
Yeah.
thing.
But because I'd done so much in this other function, it's still enough filtered through that I developed an interest in this, what you
Right.
want to call this life, if you want to say, of metaphysics. And that was their downfall. Because it was that made me conscious of what was going on. That Montauk was the source of these interfering signals. Of course they were interfering signals. They were following up my research in no end.
Was there any sense of in all the experiences that you were doing, going into the future, etc., and all of that, that there was some real higher force around? There was a higher force that existed who sort of was more in control than the people were at the station. You know, people have their little kingdoms and they think that they rule the world in a sense, but as you were going through the experience, you sensed higher forces, much higher forces, that really had something to do to say about destiny and how things go on this planet.
Al,
Very
would you care to answer that?
mystical experience is what I'm saying.
Well, since Duncan is deferring to me on that one, I'll try to answer it. I would say that during that period itself, looking back on it, there was no awareness on my part, and I don't think there was any on Duncan's part, of such a higher agency, if you will, directing our efforts at that point. I would say very definitely there was before that point, and at some time in the past we were aware of it, though perhaps not in our respective earlier lifetimes, this lifetime, but further back.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, very definitely, that there's some kind of, if you will pardon the expression, a divine plan involved in this whole thing, which is very, very difficult to explain, is very difficult to extrapolate on. There was a reason for all of this happening. I know that without any question. What that reason is still not clear. And I think Duncan would agree that, yes, he knows that there was some kind of a reason for it. Preston would probably agree with it. And he's looking at it from the mathematical, the nuts and bolts end of it to try and come up with a reason. And it's not easy. Yes, there was a reason why it happened. If you go back into, as I will shortly, go back into the Philadelphia experiment end of it, which was the beginning of the whole business, one can see from the way that thing was maneuvered that there was a higher hand of some kind involved in setting the whole thing up, because it would never have happened the way it did, unless two obscure dates, 40 years apart, coincided with two experiments.
If I could just add something directly to your question, quickly. Having to do a scene and knowing possibly some other intelligentsia. There's a function of the time tunnel where a person, or in my experience, per se, it's the only thing I can relate to, when a person moves through a number of procedures, there's a point in maybe 2/3 down the tunnel as perceived, where there's a very big thump. The energy leaves the body. There's a tendency to see on a broad scale. I can only answer that question theoretically. Looking back on it, I'm sure there is and there was some intelligence there, certainly higher form than we know. As to the recognition of it, I would have trouble in that sense, but there is what I call a full out, where the energy leaves the body, and there's a tendency to see on a very broad scale. That's partially what they were trying to do at Montauk, is to stabilize and to freeze what I call a full out, the seeing process.
They didn't want you to see it, is that what you're saying?
No, they were trying to manifest that.
Oh, they were.
For whatever their purposes.
And in your travels, did you ever go back in time and see other of your own lifetimes? Did they ever ask you to do that?
No.
Because it would seem to me that you could do that. But
You could, but it would be
theoretically.
Yeah, it wouldn't be in their interest.
No, but I just wondered if they ever asked you to.
I have no information directly, but theoretically it's very possible to influence a person's function, however, back so far.
What was the role of the aliens at all? I mean, other than the chair, which they had
Okay,
given
that would be the earlier part of this that we haven't got into yet. Let's look at another little sideline here. What was done, one of the cute little trips that they made was they made a trip from 83 back to 63 and installed him in a new body. That's all I knew of it, that they installed him in a new body. I don't know why, but Al could, of course, tell us why.
Project which started this whole business off, so far as I can determine. That was the infamous Philadelphia experiment, so-called because in its final phases was conducted in the harbor outside the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It originally began back, I'll condense this quite a bit, it originally began back in the 30s in Chicago with three people, Dr. John Hutchinson Sr., who was the dean of the University of Chicago, Nikola Tesla, and a third man by the name of Dr. Kurtenauer, who was an Austrian physicist who was apparently on staff at the University of Chicago. They decided about that time to try and do something about all of the speculation rampant at that time and for years prior about things like invisibility and how could you possibly make an object invisible and so on. They got together and researched the thing and did some work at the University of Chicago around 31, 32. In 33, the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, New Jersey was formed. And the project was transferred there probably about 34. One of the first people on staff at the University Institute of Advanced Studies was Dr. John Eric von Neumann, who is from Hungary, Budapest. He had his degree about 1925 in chemistry and 26 in physics, PhD in math, PhD in math. taught in Europe for about 4 years, then transferred to the United States. He taught at the graduate school at Preston for 3 years and was invited to join the Institute. Other people at the Institute, of course, included Albert Einstein, who left Germany in 1930, went to the California Institute of Technology for 3 years, taught there, then went to the Institute upon their invitation and acceptance. A lot of other people showed up there as time went on. But the project expanded about 1936. In the meantime, of course, Tesla was named as director of the project because he was a very good friend of a certain gentleman in the White House known as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who he had originally met in 1917 when Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy, and Tesla was asked at that time to do some work for the government, for the war effort, which he did. And they maintained their friendship. When he became president, Roosevelt, insofar as I can determine, called him down to Washington and asked him, well, how would you like to work for the government again? And since he was not terribly flush with money at that time, namely Tesla wasn't, he accepted, became involved with this project insofar as being the director was concerned. He had already been involved. And he became and retained his position as director of the so-called Invisibility Project until he resigned or left. However, it occurred in 1942. 1936, with their studies in the labs there, they decided to have some kind of an early test. They had partial results, which means they had partial invisibility. The Navy was encouraged, everybody was encouraged to continue. And of course, the Navy had been funding it almost from the beginning in terms of doing things like giving them little research money and grants and that sort of thing. It progressed onward until 1940, and I'll get a little bit out of sequence here, but in 1940, after further research and with Tesla's approach, they decided they were ready for a full test. They had a small Navy ship, probably a tender, and 2 adjacent vehicles, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and the 2 adjacent vehicles provided the power and the basic drives for the coils and the equipment they had on board the tender, with cables from either side, and the idea being if they're in the area of the Brooklyn Navy Yard with the cables, if something went wrong, they could cut the cables, and if they got desperate, they could sink the ship. Well, nothing of the kind happened. Everything worked, and the project was declared completely successful. But the important point of that 1940 test was there was no one on board the test vehicle. It was strictly a dry run, no people, no personnel. It's important because of what happened later. Now, in the meantime, other people came on board. There was a Dr. Gustav Le Bon, an associate of Van Neumann's, who became a close associate. There was a Dr. Clarkson, came in about 1940. Additionally, also came a T. Townsend Brown, who had had a strange history I won't go into. But he was had joined the Naval Reserve about 1933, and about 1939 he was tapped on the shoulder for active service by the Navy, and they wanted him specifically because of his background in gravity, gravitics, high voltage and such, to work on the problem of the German magnetic mines. He was given the status of the head of a department to develop countermeasures for the German magnetic mines and other mines, minesweeper operations for the Navy. That became important because this led into a parallel project, the degaussing project of the Navy, where they developed the so-called degaussing cables to explode the magnetic mines at a distance quite safe, quite far away from the ship. Normally they'd be triggered by the magnetic flux of the ship's general mass, which would concentrate flux lines at a certain point that would trip the mechanism, and of course, ideally the magnetic mine would be tripped under the hull and of course blow the ship to kingdom come. If you provided a strong, powerful magnetic field, it would trip the mine's sensing mechanisms at a safe distance and would be harmlessly exploded. That project was actually separate from the Invisibility Project, but was also parallel in the sense that much of the same technology was involved. Now, I became involved with this thing. We'll have to go into a little bit of a personal history. We'll again try to condense it because we are, I think, running a little late, but whatever. Quite aside from my legal name, which is on my birth certificate of Bielek, I was born in 1916, the best that I've been able to determine from my own memories and what comes up, 4 August 1916. was born Edward A. Cameron, and in 1917, I believe 15 May, this guy was born in his original body, Duncan Cameron, or whatever they called him at the time. And we were born into a family with considerable amounts of money, not really wealthy, but they were well off. And we didn't hurt for money, we didn't hurt for the means for an education. Came time we went to school, he wound up in the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, according to his readings. Took a PhD in physics in 1939. I, in the meantime, went to University of Princeton, bachelor's and master's degree, and so far as I can determine, again, from memories, took a PhD in physics from Harvard in 1939, both of us in the summer. It was arranged by our inimitable father, who had a great deal of influence with the Navy and apparently political clout in various sections and parts of the government. We do not understand how he got these connections. We don't know anything about them. There are no documents to show this. He himself served in the Navy in World War I, apparently as an ordinary recruit, did a 20-year stint, retired. At what status, we don't know. Again, the retirement papers are missing. The separation papers. We do not know whether he got involved in intelligence or not, but it would appear that he did because of its subsequent events. He didn't work, from everything we know, from that point on. He had money from the family, and he became an ardent admirer of sailboats and decided to build his own. He built one, raced it, took some trophies, would sell it and build another. In between, he was traveling back and forth to Europe, and as had been previously mentioned, he became involved in the smuggling of German scientists, Jewish scientists, out of Nazi Germany into the U.S. This ceased in 1939 when the Cold War turned to a hot war. But he had connections. We don't know how they were obtained, where they went, but it was determined that the two of us would become part of this project. When we finished our education, we were invited to join and to enlist in the Navy. We were both given commissions, September 1939. And we then did about 3 months at Provincetown, Rhode Island Academy, the naval officers. In those days, they did the so-called 90-day wonder business. But we were already fairly well prepared. We didn't go through Annapolis or anything like this. And then we were sent to the project. We were there in 39 up until, for a period in 39, then through 1940. At the time of the test in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, we were on board at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, and we also had, at that time, offices in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which again became rather important later. But we did a lot of shuttling back and forth as part of our job, and one of the reasons why we were chosen was that the Navy wanted two people to represent their interests and keep full tabs on what was going on in the tests and the development of the program, who were technically competent to report in detail what was going on and to report to the Navy in the appropriate reports which they required, exactly what was happening in our technical commentaries. And that's why the education. There was also another aspect of this involved, that aside from Tesla, who did not have a good formal education, he started out, but in 1979 his father died, and his first year in the university he was terminated and he had to go to work. He came to the U.S. in 84. He had enormous insight and an incredible intuitive insight, and solved his problems in that manner very competently. He had a perfect track record. But unlike he, Van Neumann had a PhD in math, and his mathematical background was in the turn of this century. And before he came to the United States, he met a number of other people. J. Robert Oppenheimer was in Germany at that time. He became important because at a later time Oppenheimer was involved with the atomic bomb project, but not with the invisibility program. Additionally, he met Dr. David, what was the mathematician's name? Hilbert, who was a genius of a mathematician. He developed all kinds of new math. He was essentially contemporary with Van Neumann, who was born in 1905. Hilbert was born about 1912, and he had a PhD in math, but he developed whole new systems of math, about 5 different varieties, the most important of which, and for which he was well known, was a so-called Hilbert space. And this was a new means of describing mathematically multiple realities, multiple space, which became very important to the project. Van Neumann met him about 1925, 27, in that period. and took a lot of Hilbert's work and ran with it. And Van Neumann, in turn, developed all kinds of new systems of mathematics of his own. He was also known as a real genius of a mathematician. He was considered probably the most outstanding mathematician of this century, though some people think he was better than Einstein. Of course, others don't agree. But he developed many systems of his own which became important. There was another man who was also very important as a mathematician, of which there was virtually no traceability at this time. It's an American by the name of Levinson, Dr. Levinson, born 1912, died, as far as I can determine, 1976. He's published 3 books on very involved mathematics. I finally was able to hold in my hands 2 of those 3 books. I found them very recently at the Institute of Advanced Studies Library in Princeton. Never been able to find them anywhere else, but no history of Levinson himself. He developed what was even more important, the so-called Levinson time equations. With that as a background, they were able then to go on and develop the whole system of the divisibility project as applied to a large part object. Now, in 1940, as I said, the test was successful. The Navy then decided they would go full bore, finance the thing with unlimited funds, and classify the project, of course. And we were part of it. Well, in 1941, the project was going on, and of course Tesla had full-bore enthusiasm from the Navy, and they had full confidence from the President and everybody else to go ahead. While we were at sea, because they decided the 2 of us needed some sea duty, so we spent a year, 1941, at sea, the USS Pennsylvania, as I remember, which toured the Pacific. It came back to Pearl Harbor for some repairs and dry docking in October of 41. We took some leave. We went to San Francisco. The 5th of December, we were about to board the plane back to Pearl when we were stopped by a captain who was just getting on the plane. He said, "Gentlemen, your orders are canceled. Come with me." So we met Vice Admiral Hal Bowen Sr., who was the then director of the Office of Naval Engineering, which was abolished in 46, but he was in charge of all of the research work for the Navy. And he told us, "Gentlemen, you may as well know we will be at war with Japan within 48 to 72 hours. We expect to hit Pearl Harbor. You're not going back there. You're too valuable. So we're going to leave you in San Francisco until your tour is over, which is the home base for the Pennsylvania. You do office work. You can enjoy some leave times. You might as well enjoy it, because when you go back to the Institute, there'll be no leaves and there'll be nothing but hard work." So we did. January 42, we went back to the Institute and remained there through the whole series of tests and the whole project. In the meantime, Tesla was given a ship for his full-size tests with crew. And that happened to be a battleship, unknown. But in wartime, apparently, politics has a bit of pull, and the politics coming from the President of the United States, he could probably order the Secretary of the Navy to supply any kind of ship that Tesla wanted. So he got a battleship. The equipment was designed, of course, by Tesla with a lot of work and cooperation, and you might say also a lot of fighting between Tesla and Van Neumann. Tesla was director, Van Neumann was, assistant. They didn't agree on everything. Van Neumann had a great deal of respect for Tesla's ability, but they didn't agree about everything. Tesla was insisting, as the date approached for the tests on the battleship with personnel, that they were going to have a very severe problem with personnel. He said flatly, he says, you cannot employ the large amounts of power required to make a ship of this size invisible without having a very disastrous effect on the heads of the people, and the minds or the bodies of the personnel involved, because you're talking megawatts of RF power, enormous amounts of power, and the coils, which in the early phases were like degaussing coils, were wrapped around the hull of the ship, but the later design was a set of 4 coils mounted on the deck of the ship, specially designed Tesla conical-shaped designs. And just interestingly enough, every transformer design ever built by Nikola Tesla was in conical. It was not round core. It was conically shaped, tapering towards a point at the top. Well, he knew he had a problem, Tesla. He went to the Navy, asked for more time. They wouldn't give him more time. He says, you have a deadline. And he had already been advised, and here we have to backtrack a little bit into the history of Tesla, by his own statements to the press in 1900 in Colorado Springs. He said he was in contact with intelligences from off the planet Earth, very coolly received by his scientific colleagues. He made the same announcement to the press in 1923 at the time of the Mars approach, the close approach in 23, and he made another announcement after that. And according to two people I know personally who worked with Tesla in the period in the late 30s and the early 40s, he had a great deal of RF equipment in his New York labs. He had two of them, actually. His residence at the Hotel New Yorker and a receiving station there. And he also had lab offices and a lab operation in the top towers and the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria, and those transmitters were located there. At least one of these two people said he was in contact with somebody off-planet nearly every day. He says, I didn't understand the equipment. He says, I know he was. The inference here, and the data I have, is that he was in contact with the outside, and he was getting information which says, you've got a very serious problem. You've got to solve it or you're going to lose people. They'll be dead. And so he went, based on this, to the Navy. The Navy would not give him additional time. He says, I know how to solve the problem, but he says, I need more time to design new equipment. The Navy says, there's a war on. You can just make it work. Don't change anything. Make it work. You got a deadline. So he took the only way out he knew. And that was to sabotage the project for the test which came up in March 42. So he just detuned the equipment so when the switches were thrown, nothing worked. I mean, the transmitters lit, the tubes came alive, and power was consumed, but nothing worked. No field effects, no invisibility. So he says, well, gentlemen, I guess I goofed. It's time to leave. You have a very good man here who can take over the project. Dr. Van Neumann, I'm leaving. Bye. It's debatable whether he left or was fired, or whether they said, you were fired, and he said, you can't fire me, I quit. In any case, he left. And that was the end of Tesla insofar as that project was concerned.
What year was that?
That was 1942, March. Van Neumann took over and he looked at everything. He said to the Navy, he says, I've got to make a study of this. It obviously failed. He says, I don't know what's wrong, but I'll find out. He says, I need time. And the Navy couldn't say anything. He said, give him the time. So he went ahead. We were working with him at that time. We were back and forth between the Philadelphia Navy Yard office and, of course, the Institute. I don't know where we spent more time, probably at the Institute. So Van Neumann made his own study of it and decided to change things around, and they still had the two generators that he proposed to use. In the meantime, he didn't have the battleship. It was a ship of the line that went back in service. It did not have a special crew. It had the regular crew. And they finally decided, he, of course, talking through us to the Navy brass, we needed a special ship. It would be outfitted from the ground up. So it was decided to pick one that was going to come down the ways, and they decided on DE-173, which later was named the Eldridge. And about July of 42, they were laying the keel, and it was designed, the design was modified so they could put in two huge generators. And the reason why they had to design the equipment to the ship was the fact that a destroyer escort is not a very large ship. It's about 1,500 tons, roughly equipped. The later figure said 1,900. Dry weight was agreement between both the Greek records and the American records of 1,240 tons dry. It's a rather small destroyer. It only had two gun turrets. So to fit two huge generators and the motor drive system and all the RF equipment and the four transmitters on this thing, it took a lot of design effort, actually, from the beginning to know where you're going to fit the stuff. You don't throw it on this ship in midstream after it's built. So October it came down the ways and they wanted to dry dock, put equipment on board, and before they did this, they decided they needed a special test crew. Selected about 33 people, all volunteers, trained them up at Groveland, Connecticut from about September to December of 42, and they graduated, and the picture still exists at the graduation class. And who was the head of the class but our father? This picture there with the naval uniform and the cap and scrambled eggs and the whole bit. Still don't know how he got involved in this, but he could have transferred between the Navy and the Coast Guard because there is a letter of citation still on the records, which Duncan has had, I believe, I don't know if you think he still has it, I've seen it, a letter of citation from the Coast Guard for assistance during the wartime period, meritorious assistance during the war for the Coast Guard, etc., etc. And this was the Coast Guard Academy at Groveland where this crew was trained. So they came back to Philadelphia. And the work continued. The equipment was outfitted. And they started after the ship was not seaworthy, but actually out of dry dock, sitting at the dockside at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. a long series of tests began, a lot of modification of equipment. Along about March of 42, Van Neumann started to shake a little and became concerned that maybe there's a personnel problem. He started to agree with it because Duncan and myself were both pounding on him, saying, there's going to be a personal problem. You can't turn the switch on. You're going to possibly kill people. Tesla said so. Well, the mention of Tesla's name, he got very upset. He would fly into a rage, eventually got over it. But he agreed, yeah, maybe there is a problem. What do we do about it? He decided to put in a third generator and modify the system, and at that point he still had time to do it. So he ordered and had installed a third generator along about May of 43. And it never worked right. It wouldn't sync with the other two. The other two generators, I might add, were driven off a single motor and a gearbox, right-angle gearbox drive with special electronics to synchronize the generators, because with a motor of about 750 horsepower and a gigantic gearboxes required, those gearboxes were sloppy. You could not mechanically synchronize the generators. They had to be an absolute electrical sync, so that was accomplished by other synchronizing means with special cabinets. And there's another man whom I know of who designed that equipment. And he's still alive, too. Anyway, the third generator never worked right. Finally, it went out of control one day and zapped one of the individuals assigned to us as a technician, a Navy man, first-class specialist. He was laid out completely unconscious in a coma. They hauled him off to the hospital. He recovered 4 months later, was never part of the project. So Van Neumann finally said, all right, that thing's no good, pull it out, back to the original design. On this went, finally had their sea trial for the ship about mid-June. July 1, they decided to go into the final series of tests and preparation. So about July 20th of 43, they decided, well, I guess it's ready, and make our tests. So they decided 22 July, got the whole crew together, selected about 12 individuals plus the two of us who were in the control room to operate all the equipment. There was another man who was a radio operator who was, I believe, still alive today. I've not been able to talk with him. So the fateful hour came. They ran the ship out into the harbor, stopped the engines. They did not drop anchor because they had to be floating free as it would be normally in service, and they could not ground the ship with the anchors. So it came to a stop. The orders came via radio, fire up and go through the procedures, in which we did. The ship became invisible optically as well as radar. And it lasted about 15-20 minutes. They finally said, okay, shut it off. Bring the ship back to dock, to the dockside berth, which was done by the crew. They boarded it to expect it, and they found out there were problems. There were a lot of people on that ship who were thoroughly disoriented, sick, nauseous, and otherwise not with it. No one was dead, no one was injured as such physically, but the mind effects were severe, both physiological and psychological. Navy said, okay, pull the crew off. What's wrong? Back to Dr. Van Neumann. He says, I don't know, I've got to find out. So he started looking into this, and he finally decided he needed more time to study it. He said to the Navy, he says, this is going to take more time to look at. And he says, you have a drop-dead deadline of the 12th of August, 1943, to get this experiment completed, otherwise forget it. And he says, that isn't enough time. He says, that's your deadline. Well, we heard that. Duncan, or particularly I, went to we went up the line. We went to Hal Bowen and said, what's this all about? He says, that's the orders I was given. He says, where did they come from? He says, I don't know, but I'll find out. We went all the way up to the CNO, which didn't make sense because the Chief of Naval Operations normally doesn't concern himself with that kind of detail in the research program. He's concerned with the operation of the war. But of course, at the same time, there was the other project called the Atomic Bomb Project, Manhattan Project, as it was known then, which was vying with this as the secret weapon for the war. So as things went on, there were night and day operations to get this equipment in order. Van Neumann made changes because the Navy finally decided they don't want optical invisibility, they don't want radar invisibility only. At that time, we didn't have inertial guidance systems. We didn't have lower-end shore-end worldwide. And, of course, if you didn't have radar to see where an adjacent ship was, you better be able to see it physically. Otherwise, in the fleet, you might ram each other at sea at night. So that was the orders. He modified the equipment. On the 12th of August, rather shaking as we went out into our station, we knew things were wrong. And, well, we followed orders. The orders were, at the appropriate time, turn on the equipment, which we did. For about 60 or 70 seconds, everything looked good. They got the radar invisibility. The ship outline could be seen hazily. It was still more or less visible. And then, as memory serves, and as the observers said later, there's a flash of light, blue flash, and the ship just disappeared. Wasn't seen anymore, no outline in the water, no hull, nothing. No radio communication, gone for about 3 hours. And it came back. They knew immediately something was wrong because one of the masts, the principal radio mast, which had been designed by T. Townsend Brown, along with some of the transmitter equipment and modifications, was broken. There was some superstructure damage, and they couldn't get any radio communications, and they couldn't get the ship to maneuver, so they went out and boarded it, and that's when they found the real extent of the problem. There were 4 men embedded in the decks, 2 in the steel decks on top, 2 on the bulkhead walls, and the 5th man had his hand jammed in the steel of the wall. He lived because they could cut his hand off and give him an artificial hand. People disoriented. Reports were some were floating around and finally got their feet on the ground. Others floated away and disappeared. The crew on the second test was a little larger than the first. And a number who were just plain totally insane. So the Navy said, get that ship back in here, get the crew off. They held 4 days worth of meetings. What's wrong? What do we do now? And this, of course, involved all the top brass, plus Van Neumann, plus the scientists. They couldn't come to any real conclusions as to what was wrong or what to do. And eventually decided there would be one more test on the Eldridge, and there would be a dry run again like the original one. No personnel. Rebuilt the equipment. They would run it by remote cables, about 1,000-foot of cable from the adjacent ship.
No generators on the ship itself.
Everything on the ship as it was originally for the second test.
Okay.
But they would use the crew to take it out into the outer harbor at night and then remove the crew and control the equipment remotely, which they did in late October. And same results in essence, but no crew to be damaged. The ship disappeared for about 20 minutes, came back. A lot of equipment was missing, 2 transmitter cabinets, 1 generator. Everything in the control room was a burned out shambles, even though nobody was there. The 1 cabinet with the 0-time reference generator was still intact. The Navy at that point just said, that's it, and wipe our hands of it, stripped the ship, re-outfit it so it can go to sea, and of course it had already been christened and properly commissioned with its regular officer, which is of record, and sometime in the fall it was ready and went to sea, and the log, which was later recovered by the Greeks after the war was over, and the Eldridge, which had gone into mothballs in 1946 and was transferred to the Greek Navy in 1951. The log had all of the pages missing prior to January 144. So the problem, and the question was, what really happened? What went wrong? Now this is where, at that time, we didn't know what was going on. But that is after the first test, we didn't see anything wrong. After the second test, we knew what was going on. That is, he and I did, because what happened was very, very bizarre. The ship disappeared into hyperspace. And the important point was there was another experiment going on at the same time, and that was the Phoenix Project, which 12 August 1983 was exactly 40 years to the day later. And what's important about this is the fact that it was a 40-year separation exactly, actually a multiple of 20 years. Work done since then, or perhaps during that period and ongoing, has shown that, like humans who have a biorhythm, the Earth has a biorhythm. And the Earth's biorhythms peak out, 4 of them, 20 years to the day, plus or minus maybe half a day, every 20 years on August 12th, 1943, 63, 83, 2003, whatever. And it just happened to peak, or shall we say, maybe it just happened, maybe it was arranged this way. The August test in 43, August 12th, coincided with the station running August 12th, 83. and provided an additional function which provided the connecting link through the Earth's fields for the two experiments to lock up in hyperspace. The ship was pulled into hyperspace completely. And the only way it could be returned was we decided, he and I, we couldn't control the ship. We knew something was drastically wrong. We tried to shut the equipment off, and we could not. We tried pulling handles and everything. Nothing would yield. We just got half electrocuted. We finally decided, let's get out of here. Well, where do we go? We jump over the side and land in the bay, get away from this thing. Well, we jumped overboard, and we didn't land in the bay. We wound up through a time tunnel and wound up standing on dry ground at Montauk in 1983, August 12th at night. And of course, we were found very quickly. We were taken downstairs. Van Neumann greeted us. Of course he knew us. He knew we were coming. The thing was a bit of a shock because here we were just working with Van Neumann 43, who was a young man essentially, and here we see Van Neumann 83, an old man, who knew we were coming, knew what it was all about. He said, gentlemen, we have a problem. He said, we have a lockup through hyperspace. And I said, we knew this was going to happen because I had the records. He said, I've lived with this 40 years waiting for this day, so to speak. He says, we can't shut this thing down because the Eldridge is the source of the power running this thing from the other end. It's in hyperspace. It says, you guys have to go back and shut the thing off. He says, we know you did. The records say so. But of course you haven't done it yet, but you're going to have to go back and shut it off. So he says, shut it off any way you can. Destroy it physically if you have to, which is, of course, what we did. We went back to the Eldridge. They had, of course, the time capability to send us back directly to that spot and location. Quite aside from the movie and what it said. We went back, we took out the axis, and we just started cutting cables right and left till the generators shut down and the equipment was off. We smashed tube banks, we smashed equipment, we cut cables, we cut everything in sight. Generators went down, the ship returned to its original point in space and time about 3 hours later. And of course, the Navy found what was there. I remained with the ship, he went back to 83. Begins another part of the story, but from that point on, 43 on, Van Neumann in 43 didn't know what had happened except what I told him. He didn't believe it. But he had equipment which enabled myself to go back and forth between 43 and 83. He had another set of equipment in the labs, which actually was the early equipment, which was the prototype. And he had modified it, which the Navy didn't know at that time, to be a full-blown time travel machine.
In 43?
In 43, correct. See, the Germans also were working on the time travel project, and they had it working in 45, just before the war ended, in Germany. This is also a matter of record.